Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Art Deco Society UK's June webinar with Dr. Christopher Long of the University of Texas. Chris will be speaking about Jock Peters, a great forgotten figure of American modernism and Art Deco in Southern California. To introduce myself, I'm Ruthie Good. I'm the Art Deco Society UK's events coordinator. And I'll shortly be introducing Chris. But before that, I do need to go over the house rules as usual. Firstly, to remind you that we have auto-generated captions. If you require them, just click CC Live Transcription on your screen and then click Show Subtitles. The next thing is to remind you that this is the webinar format, which is different from a normal Zoom meeting. So you'll only be able to see me, then our speaker, Chris, but we can't see or hear you at all, so feel free to relax. At the end, we'll be holding a question and answer session with Chris. So if you'd like to ask questions or make a comment related to any part of his talk, please type it into the Q&A section on your screen at any point during the talk, and we'll ask all the questions at the end. As always, please be respectful and thoughtful with your questions and comments. I know you will be. That's it for house rules. And so I'm now delighted to introduce Dr. Christopher Long of the University of Texas, where he is Martin S. Kermesse Centennial Professor of Architecture. The title of his talk tonight is Jock Peters, The Varieties of Modernism. Chris has also taught in Vienna and Prague and has written or contributed to over 50 publications on modern architectural history. His most recent publication is Jock Peters, Architecture and Design, The Varieties of Modernism, which is available on Amazon, and we are going to share a link. So hopefully you'll be interested in having a look at the book, maybe purchasing it. At this point, I'd like to quickly share a review of the book by Bennett Johnson, which was published in the Chicago Art Deco Society magazine in summer 2022, which said, "Vintage photos and Long's lively and authoritative text capture the groundbreaking design of Peters' stunning interiors. I highly recommend this beautiful book and encourage readers to add it to your Deco library alongside Long's noteworthy books on Ken Weber and Paul T. Frankel." So Chris has also written about Adolf Loos, Joseph Frank, and as mentioned in the review, Paul T. Frankel and Ken Weber, to name just four, and he's curated and collaborated on numerous exhibitions. So thank you, Chris. We're really looking forward to this, and now it's over to you.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Ruthie, for your kind words and lovely introduction. I want to also thank my publisher who's on with us this evening, Beth Doherty from New York. She took this project on, bless her, which was no mean feat because Jock Peters was and remains, I think, an underappreciated and underknown, if one can say it that way, architect. Quite an extraordinary figure, but someone who's not yet fully received his due. And what I'd like to do for you this evening is to tell you his story in brevis, and then spend a little bit of time talking about why I think he's such an extraordinary contributor to the narrative, to the story of Art Deco. For Peters, both falls within the context of what we would think of as the normal limits of the Art Deco, but then also outside of it. That's partly the explanation of my subtitle of my book, The Varieties of Modernism. Jock Peters was German. He was born in far northern Germany, not too far from the Danish border. He was the son of a farmer who lost his farm when Peters was just a boy. The family moved to Hamburg, and Peters received most of his education in that North German city. Peters was educated in the primary schools in Hamburg and then was apprenticed to a stonemason, a rather prominent figure in Hamburg in that period. You see a photograph of him here, by the way, just about the time that he completed his apprenticeship. The man who was his teacher, his master stonemason, did something really quite extraordinary at that time, and that was he gifted him 2 years of his apprenticeship so that Peters could study at one of the schools in Hamburg, the school for what we would translate as building contractors. Peters didn't want to be a stonemason ultimately, he wanted to be an architect. He didn't have the funding to go to an architecture school at that point in his life, so he got a degree as a building contractor, worked for various firms in and around Hamburg for a couple of years, and then decided to go on a sojourn to the Netherlands to see the newest architecture of figures like Berlage and others. He asked his former professor at the building trades school for some introductions, and the introduction that his professor gave him was not of a Dutch architect, but of his son-in-law, a man who was working in Dusseldorf, who was a fairly prominent architect in the modern context, a man named Carl Gustav Benzel. Peters went and met with Benzel, who was supposed to give him actually introductions to the Dutch architects, but Peters ended up being quite fascinated with Benzel and quite liking him, and so he remained in Dusseldorf working with Benzel. At that point, by the way, had some commissions to design buildings back in Hamburg, including this one you see here, the Levante House. And what was extraordinary about Benzel was the degree to which he not only recognized Peters' talent, for Peters was truly talented, but also that he would allow him as a very young um, uh, budding designer to design the facade for this building. Really quite extraordinary and important commission early on. Peters did end up going to the Netherlands. He went for a few months, went back, and then ended up working for Benzel. Very quickly was promoted to being his chief assistant. And together with another man, a developer named Franz Bach, they work on one of the important buildings in Hamburg in this period, the Karstadt department store, which, as you can see here very clearly, is in the language of the Biedermeier combined a little bit with what we would think of as the Gothic revival. Not terribly atypical for that period in Germany in 1912, 1913. More predictive of what was going to happen in German architecture was another project they worked on together, a large commercial building in Hamburg from around 1914, which certainly showed the direction of German post-war architecture. But much more important for our story of Jock Peters as an Art Deco designer was another building he worked on with Benzel in 1914. It was a competition design for the expansion of the Hamburg Art Museum, the Kunsthalle, and you can see it here. It's a beautiful and very interesting melding of classical form language and modernism. Not so terribly dissimilar, by the way, from the work of Ludwig Mies van der Rohe exactly in this period. He was also working on an art museum for Cora Müller in this period, and a villa that looks quite similar. But you can see now how Peters is thinking about, along with Benzel, thinking about ways in which to take the classical repertoire and bring it into a modern discourse, you could say, of architecture. They next worked on a very large project. It was for the new power station for the city of Hamburg. By this time, by the way, Benzel had moved his practice to Hamburg because it's where he was getting most of his work. This is one of the etchings that Peters made of the project. These are the twin stacks and the sort of control building for the power station. You can see, by the way, something else very important about Peters, and that was that he was an extraordinarily facile renderer. He drew remarkably well. Even as a boy, he had been very good with a pencil and pen. And Benzel recognized this, and pretty much from this point on, all the renderings from their office came from Peters, not from Benzel. They're all in his hand, in other words. In 1914, of course, the war broke out. Benzel was immediately drafted and sent off to the front. Peters who went and volunteered for duty, was actually furloughed. He was assigned to an artillery unit, but furloughed. And because Benzel was already away at the front, Peters went and worked for Peter Behrens, the most important German architect of the period in Berlin, on the recommendation of Benzel. This is the period just after after Behrens had lost his three most important assistants. For working in his office just before this time were Le Corbusier, Walter Gropius, and Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. It's a pretty good architecture staff. Peters became, again, the first assistant for Behrens, an indication of just how talented he was. But Behrens was very much a different kind of animal than Benzel was, and didn't allow Peters very much freedom in terms of his design. Peters rendered Behrens's designs, not the other way around. One of the extraordinary things I found, by the way, when I was doing the research for this book, was a letter from Behrens confirming Peters's employment in his office. Works from Behrens's hand are extremely rare because his entire archive was actually destroyed in World War II. And so this was something of a find, to see something in his language and see something in this sense directly from his hand. It confirmed what Peters had worked on in Behrens's office, but it also indicated how little actually freedom he had. Peters worked on a few projects as a freelancer in this period. One of those was a festival of gymnastics building in Hamburg, which was not built, but in the language already of the German Expressionism. Very soon after this time, he was drafted and sent to the front. It was discovered, however, just before he went into action, that he had tuberculosis. He was immediately pulled out of his unit so he wouldn't infect the other soldiers and assigned to a factory in Belgium making war material for the German army. And you can see it here. It made sense because Peters had a lot of experience with doing things like casting from his time as a stonemason. And so he worked in the factory until 1918. The problem with that was that it was damp, it was cold, not the ideal thing for somebody with tuberculosis. By 1918, Peters was actually in very, very poor health. He was infected with the Spanish flu and very nearly died. He developed a case of pleurisy. They pulled him out of the factory and sent him back to Berlin, where fortunately he got the treatment he needed to survive. But he effectively lost the use of one of his lungs. He was a very sick man for most of the rest of his life. In the period in which he was working in the factory, Peters continued to do or take part in competitions. One of those competitions was for a war memorial church in Hamburg. And you can see here already the extent to which he's beginning to think about the possibilities of a new form of classicism, a classicism that's united with the language of modernism. It's also a kind of prescient design in the sense that it looks a little Mendelssohnian, borrowing, in other words, from the language of Erich Mendelssohn. But the very interesting thing here is the extent to which it's novel, because Mendelssohn was not known yet in 1916. This is an entirely original design. You can see this is the courtyard of the building and the interior. The interior shows, again, something else that was very important in German design in this period, and that's the emergence of Expressionism. So Peters here is allying Expressionism, classicism in its pure form, and what we would now term Art Deco into a singular composition. Peters, though, is very interesting as a designer, for he continued to look at all kinds of possibilities. The next year, in 1917, and then into 1918, when this was rendered, he worked on a villa that was ultimately not built for a client in Hamburg. And you can see the extent to which it borrows very directly from the language of Frank Lloyd Wright. Peters had come into contact with Wright's books when he was working for Behrens and had a very clear understanding of what Wright was doing. What's interesting here is you see a building that's very Wrightian, but rendered in a way that's quite well expressionist. After the war, Peters returned to Hamburg. He began working for a very prominent architect in Hamburg in that period, a man named Fritz Höger. Höger was one of the great expressionist architects of the post-war period. He designed his own apartment, which you see here, in the language of expressionism with a kind of overlay of classicism. Again, very typical of him in the sense that he borrowed here and there and then transformed each of these borrowings into something new and quite original. Peters, of course, by 1921 was also looking at the same influences that everyone else in Germany was looking at, and that was namely Erich Mendelssohn. And you can see him here sort of making renderings in a kind of Mendelssohnian way, thinking about what he might actually do with that Mendelssohnian form language. And by 1921, he had actually moved on from Hergé's office and was heading up a school of arts and crafts in nearby Altona. Altona is the city just across the river from Hamburg, not part of Greater Hamburg. He ended up directing the school, and the school was in fairly terrible condition physically. So he was thinking about how he might design a new facility for the school. That was not, of course, done. But you can also see here, even looking back to 1916, how Peters was very, very interested in this idea of the possibilities not only of streamlining, as we would call it now, but also of a kind of machined or machine-like aesthetic. Really quite extraordinary thing for that early for 1916. In 1921, Peters, like many, many architects in Europe, took part in, or at least was thinking about taking part in the Chicago Tribune competition. This is his own entry, or at least his own idea for an entry. In the end, he didn't actually enter the competition with this design. It's an extraordinary thing, and it took me a long time to figure out what it is. It's Mendelssohnian, of course, and expressionist, but I realized that that wooden tower is actually an ice cream stick. So it must have been a tiny thing. It must have been about what 10 centimeters tall, something like that, modeled here with cardboard and a stick. It was not entered, and instead, what happened was that Peters left. He left Germany for what he thought was a brief tour or a brief trip to Southern California. His younger brother was working in Pasadena, just past Los Angeles on the east side, as a building contractor. Peters went to spend a few months with him also because the warm, dry climate of Los Angeles seemed to be a much better solution for his tuberculosis than living in damp Hamburg. And again, he was having fairly significant health problems in 1921, 1922. He arrived in late 1922 in Los Angeles, was immediately enamored of Los Angeles and its climate and everything else, and decided to stay, leaving, by the way, his wife and 5 children back in Hamburg. He and his brother set up a business to make or to sell designs to architects and other contractors. This is one of the ones that they did together. You can see it signed Peters and Peters below, and then Pasadena. Of course, it's Spanish colonial revival, but rendered in a way that borrowed fairly significantly from the language of people like Wright and Otto Wagner. That the rendering technique, that sort of Japanisme rendering technique, was certainly borrowed from the Central European context and reapplied in this case into Southern California. But it's not what he ended up doing. Pretty quickly, Peters became interested in the other Wright, Lloyd Wright, Frank Lloyd Wright's son, who was living in Southern California by this time. They became friends, in fact. And you can see him kind of working here in that other Wrightian vocabulary. This would be about 1923. In a pretty accomplished way. This was not built, but you can see that he had a pretty quick understanding of what the Wrights, but especially Lloyd Wright, was doing. Instead, what Peters did was he started working for the movies. It made a lot of sense for him because his English wasn't very good, and many of the figures in Hollywood in this period were German emigres. He ended up working for a very prominent figure in the film industry in this period, man named Hans Dreyer, who was originally from Munich, who was working for a company called Famous Players Lasky that became Paramount Pictures. And you can see this is a very early set design that Peters did for a film that I couldn't identify from 1923, but under the tutelage of Dreyer. Here we can see very, very clear that he's already become to master that form language of the Art Deco, but it's still being combined with those zigzag forms of expressionism, of later expressionism. Pretty quickly, Peters was designed to more important projects, including what was supposed to be the blockbuster for Famous Players Lasky, a movie they were calling The City of the Future. This was borrowed from a variety of different sources. It was kind of a cobbled together story, but it involved, a romance set into a futuristic environment. Peters rendered the entire city, what would have been the sets for it or the backdrops, in very, very large scale. What you're seeing here is about 1.5 meters by 2.5 meters. It's a very, very large rendering in chalk. What happened in the end was, despite the extraordinary qualities of this design, famous players Lasky decided not to film the movie because of the appearance of Metropolis, which came out almost at the same time, and they thought they couldn't compete with Metropolis, so they canned the movie. And instead, Peter started working on another project, a project called Mars. Mars was based on a novelette by Edgar Rice Burroughs, who wrote Tarzan. And again, it's about, the official title was A Princess on Mars. And what you see here is the power station of Mars. This is an extraordinary rendering, one of the more extraordinary renderings I've ever actually come into contact with in my years of doing this. It's certainly related to what we see in Metropolis. It's also related, of course, to the language of late Expressionism, also the burgeoning language both of Art Deco and the new streamlining. You can see a solitary figure in the center moving a big lever, very much like the figure in the center of the great machine in Metropolis. That's clearly, derivative in that sense. But what wasn't derivative was the next rendering I'm going to show you, which is so extraordinary. It's the elevator station on Mars. For in Mars, the powerful people live up in the sky, and they take these chutes or these elevators down to the ground level. You can see a figure here wearing what looks very much like a Bauhausian costume from Oskar Schlemmer. But the rendering here is so interesting because you're actually looking up through the ceiling. So it's rendered so that we can actually read the top of the building as well. And you can see this, beautiful Art Deco inspired finial at the top and all the cutouts. Really, really remarkable piece of work. By the way, you can also see here very clearly Peters's signature. It's a J and a D and a P, his initials that are combined with an Egyptian Ankh, the sign of life. Over the next several years, Peters continued to work for famous players Lasky until 1927. He also freelanced during this time. He did this design for a house in the Hollywood Hills, also not built, really quite extraordinary thing. This house is so prescient, you could build this today and it would not look in any way out of place. But eventually, by the end of 1927, Peters had quit famous players. By now Paramount Pictures. He didn't like working for the studios. This was fairly typical of designers in Los Angeles. And he decided to go into business with his brother. This was their business card. Again, you can see his signature, the J, the D, the P, and the Ankh. And they were going to make modern furniture and sell it. It made sense because at this point, Peters didn't have an architectural license anyway. He couldn't have worked as an architect in Los Angeles, and furniture was an easier business to be in. Among the things that they made as prototypes was a bookcase made by George, who was the brother, in a language that was, we would think of as Art Deco, but it also certainly was inspired by Japanese and Chinese design, of which there were many examples in Los Angeles in this period. It was certainly something that the brothers could have readily seen. You can see it's lacquered wood. As far as I know, only this one prototype was made. I don't think they ever manufactured it. And ultimately, they began working in a different way. They began working with other cabinet makers, making things that could be sold into the relatively wealthy homes of the Hollywood elite. I don't know. This was a blackline print I found in the archive. I don't know if this piece was ever made. It's pretty extraordinary, but it is predictive of what Peters would do a few years hence. And I'll show you another interior that Peters rendered right around this time. This would have been around 1927, possibly 1928. Again, of a very much Art Deco, as we would think of it, inspired interior, or in the language of the Art Deco, certainly. Again, unclear whether this was ever executed or whether this is simply a presentation drawing for a project that was not finished. The first project of this series that I know was done was this one, Desmond's, which was a clothier in downtown Los Angeles. Peters came by this project because the firm that was one story up from him in downtown Los Angeles. He had an office in one of the downtown skyscrapers. Was an interior design firm that was working in the modernist form language. Their name was File and Paradise. And they met one day in the elevator, and File asked Peters, you have any work right now? And Peter said, no, I don't have a lot of work. So I said, good, you can detail the exterior of Desmond's for us, which he did. They were very, very satisfied with the work he did. It was a very upscale clothier, so it was all done, in this case, in beautiful black marble, and black and white marble, actually, and then terracotta. And as a consequence, File in Paradise then hired him to do several other projects, including this one. It was in a ticket office for a new airline called Maddox in Los Angeles, 1928. Maddox eventually, by the way, became TWA Airlines. A fairly prominent company later on. And you can see very, very beautiful example, 1928 now, of what we would think of as high Art Deco, with a really extraordinarily lovely blade sign, really very compelling and interesting graphics. You can see one of the airplanes flying. Here you can see the building from the other side. And what it does is it shows the route of the airline, starting in San Francisco and then flying south to Oakland, Fresno, Bakersfield, Los Angeles, San Diego, Tijuana, and then eventually to Ensenada, Mexico, which is where one of the big racetracks, horse racetracks, was in that period. And you see just absolutely beautiful graphics on the building, and even more extraordinary on the interior. You can see the airplanes from below and the ceiling. From the side, they were flying Ford trimotor airplanes. And all of these images were not only drawn by Peters, but he actually painted them himself. So this is a kind of Gesamtkunstwerk, kind of total work of art for Peters. Again, File in Paradise were very, very pleased with the design, as was Maddox, and that would have significant consequences for Peters, because the next year, File in Paradise were hired to do the interiors for one of the most important new buildings in Los Angeles, the new department store of Bullock's. Bullock's had a big department store downtown, but they were moving out to Wilshire Boulevard by Hollywood, because that's where a lot of the business was. And the building was designed by two of the very, very well-known architects in Los Angeles in this period, John Parkinson and his son, Donald B. Parkinson. John Parkinson was an English emigre, by the way, living in Los Angeles, and did many other important buildings in Los Angeles, including the City Hall and the Los Angeles Coliseum. They were not, however, particularly adept as interior designers, and so as a consequence, Bullock's hired File in Paradise to do the lower two floors of the building, only the lower two floors. File in Paradise were involved in several other projects, and so they actually farmed the commission out to Peters. Peters then was assigned to make a preliminary rendering for the lobby to show the clients. File in Paradise told him what they wanted, and he rendered it quite exactly as they told him to do it. And the clients were very, very unhappy with this. They wanted something much more elegant, much more upscale, and certainly much more Art Deco in its form language. The consultant for the store on design matters was a woman named Eleanor Lemaire. She would become a very significant commercial designer later on in New York. And they very nearly fired File in Paradise. Instead, what happened is the Peters went back to the office, very, very quickly rendered a new version, which he then took to Bullock's and to Eleanor Lemaire. And you see it here. And this is quite exactly what they wanted. They wanted something much more modern for 1928, 1929, and they wanted something very much more in that language, that cutting edge language of the Art Deco. And so in the end, de facto, Bullock's fired File in Paradise, so that they kept them on. They did one space, and the rest of the commission went to Jock Peters and a few other architects who were actually designers, who were then working with Lemaire to do some of the other floors. The concourse, as it was completed, is one of the extraordinary interiors in the United States in this period. It's in beautiful materials. One of the things that Peters was very good with was working in stone, because of his background as a stonemason. He understood how to use stone. He understood how to pick it out. And Bullock's had deep pockets, so they spent a lot of money doing this space. By the way, the concourse, as you see it here, is virtually still complete. This building is now owned by a law school, the Southwestern Law School. They know what they have, and they've taken great care to ensure that the building has been preserved. They've spent an extraordinary amount of money for lawyers on architecture, bless them. And you can see even the vitrines are very largely intact. The contents are not, but the vitrines are still very largely intact. The whole downstairs, the lower two floors, but especially the lower floor in Bullock's, is this extraordinary essay on the possibilities of what Art Deco could be. You can see here, this is the elevator grouping at the end of the hall. At the very back, and I can show you here if we go back to the very end, and that's where the elevators are. There was a large porte-cochere here. This is the back of the building where you would park. If you were a pedestrian, you'd come in from the front, but most people came into the building from the back, which is why the elevators were there. The elevators themselves, by the way, if you have an eye for this and you're particularly a fan, since this is the Art Deco Society of the UK, you may actually recognize these. These were used as props, or a version of this was used as a prop for the Poirot series in his building in London. Not actually in the building, but you see it in one, I think actually in two of the scenes in the Poirot series. They're still actually intact. They're beautiful compositions in various woods and various metals, including brass and nickel. One of the things that I pulled out of the grandson's collection was the original rendering for the elevator doors, and you can see it here. All of this, by the way, was made on site because Bullock's hired 100 artisans that were working in what's now the parking lot in the back in temporary buildings to fabricate everything that Peters and Lemaire were rendering. So they were doing literally on site and installing as they went. This entire commission, and it is extraordinary when you look at this building, to imagine all of this was done in less than 11 months from start to finish, the entire interior. Other local designers were hired to do features of the building, including Stoyana's mural. This is in the sportswear department. The furniture, all the furniture you see are all the vitrines. That was all Peter's work, but the mural itself above was the work of Stoyana. You also see something else very, very interesting in Peters's work, and that was a very sophisticated understanding of the possibilities of modern lighting. Here, for example, he wraps a beam in fluorescent tubes, making basically virtue out of necessity, making something actually really quite attractive out of something that was not particularly appealing as a light source. You also see here a space he did in concert with Eleanor Lemaire and another Swiss-born architect named John Weber. The sofa you see here, and then the floor pattern is Weber's. The rest of the work was Lemaire's and Weber's, but really extraordinarily beautiful composition in the possibilities of everything that Art Deco could offer in that period. This is, by the way, one of the very earliest appearances of tubular steel furniture in the United States. 1929 is the first time that one sees tubular steel furniture in the United States, coming out of Germany, of course. But everything within the store on the ground floor and a lot of the second floor was designed by Peters very specifically for its location. So every space was different, every room was different, every, you could say, department was different. This is the mirror out of the women's department, which was sold not too long ago in New York. One of the very interesting things about this design is that Bullock's didn't want to sell anything on conventional clothes racks. So there were no hangers, no clothes racks, no mannequins. So everything was either put on tables or set into vitrines or shown on live mannequins. And so Peters designed a whole series of different tables. This is the table from the sportswear department. It's now in the collection of the Los Angeles Museum of Art, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and you can see it here from the top. And again, beautiful, beautiful exercise in woodwork, all made on site by the artisans that Bullock's had hired to do the project. And here you can see one of the extraordinary pieces that came out of the building, still extant. There are two of these radiator covers. They're still for sale. If you're interested, I will put you in contact with the firm that's selling them. Absolutely extraordinary. These are the radiator covers, and they were also used as displays. here something that appears to be a desk, like a working desk, but this was one of the displays in the menswear department. So they had ties on here. And Peters would design, for example, a series of loops, and you could wind a pair of socks through it, or a necktie, or something like that, or even gloves, so that you could display the wares on these tabletops in a really attractive and interesting way. And he did dozens of these different designs, really quite remarkable. It's also remarkable, I don't have it in this presentation, but he designed, I think, more than 20 different clocks throughout the store. When Bullock's was finished at the beginning of 1930, which is exactly at the moment, of course, that the Great Depression hit, Bullock's was considered by many critics to be the most important modernist interior in the United States. Peters rocketed to fame. He became very well known very, very quickly. And as a consequence, working with Lemaire, he got a commission to design a very upscale women's clothing shop on East 57th Street, which, as you know, is the heart of the very expensive shopping district of New York, just off Fifth Avenue, for a company called L.P. Hollander. Hollander was a Boston firm that had gone back to the middle of the 19th century. This was their New York location. They had actually bought out the old Stuyvesant Villa, one of the great sort of old Dutch families, and they put in there what we would now call a sliver building, very narrow, tall building. And Peters and Lemaire were hired then to do the entire interior. This is the concept that Peters created to get the job from a company. Hollander was a fairly conservative company, so this was an interesting exercise in trying to convince them to quote unquote go modern, which they did. And Peters and Lemaire did the entire 8th-floor store in about 10 months from start to finish. And you can see here, this is the ground floor concourse. So very similar to what they'd done at Bullock's, just at much smaller scale. What was interesting here about the building is every floor was different, every department was different, but even the elevator doors in each floor were different. So again, they were kind of signage for what was happening at the different levels of the store as one went up and through it. The whole building was filled with different furniture designs that Peters had done, most of them by Peters. George did some of them, his brother, and they also hired some of their Los Angeles designers to design some of the pieces, which were then fabricated either in Los Angeles, or the drawings were sent to New York and they were fabricated there. This was the Debonair shop. The Debonair shop was clothing for younger women. And the same idea as in Bullock's, nothing was shown on hangers. Everything was either shown on live mannequins or on other kinds of displays. It's also worth noting here, again, how very, very talented Peters was with lighting, with different forms of lighting. And you can see here kind of columnist light. You can see clerestories. You can see ceiling lights. A whole variety of ways of bringing light into what was actually a very narrow and dark space. Here's the fur department, again, with a wall of glass that's backlit to bring in the light in the space. And again, all of these furnishings were designed by Peters and fabricated either in New York or in Los Angeles. And here you can see remarkably the extent to which this was a complete design. For Peters also designed the delivery car and the livery of the driver. So there it is, L.P. Hollander. And even more remarkably, he did a whole series of drawings. I can't show all of them to you, for the shoe boxes and hat boxes. This was one of my favorites. I don't know which one they ended up actually making because almost nothing out of the store survived. So I'll tell you why in a moment. Here you can see this is the hat box for L.P. Hollander, really quite extraordinarily beautiful design. This is all 1930. When the store opened, it was open very briefly for just 2 or 3 months, and then it closed because the Depression had hit in earnest, and they simply couldn't make it go of it financially. The store, which would have cost the equivalent of many millions of pounds or dollars in that period, was first sat idle for a few months, and then they ripped absolutely everything out. And as far as I can tell, everything went into the dumpster. Absolutely nothing from this entire installation has survived to the present day. It's a remarkable waste, a remarkable loss. For this would have been, and you can see it very clearly here and here, this would have been one of the most extraordinary interiors of the period, regardless of country, regardless of place. It was really a tour de force of modern design. Peters continued to work as a freelance designer through this period, although he was nominally still employed by Fallen Paradise. on the Bullocks project. You can see this is the Christmas card he sent to Ken Weber. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with my Ken Weber book and the story of Ken Weber. So this came out of the Ken Weber collection. In 1931, Peters was working back in Hollywood. He worked for a company called Irene Limited. Irene was Irene Gibbons, who was the sister of Cedric Gibbons, one of the great designers. He was the designer for MGM in this period. And you can see she had a dress shop in Hollywood. She made a lot of the clothing for the Hollywood elite. And this is the design that Peters did for her. One. He also worked right around this time on a project with a developer in what's now Calabasas on the other side of the mountain from Malibu. It was going to be a whole settlement of modernist houses. It was going to be kind of a modernist play space for the rich and famous of the Hollywood community. And among those who worked on this project were R.M. Schindler. So really important Los Angeles architects were hired to do this. This was labeled as Park Moderne Lodge Type B. So I'm assuming, although Lodge Type A didn't survive, there must have been a Lodge Type A. A few of these buildings were completed. And then once again, because of the date, 1930, 1931, the development went out of business and nothing was finished. So again, we see another project of Peters that didn't come to be. The Depression was so bad by the end of 1931 that Peters did what he really didn't want to do, and that was to go back to work for Paramount. He worked for Paramount for another year and a half until towards the end of 1933. This is one of the films he did. It's One Night with You. You can see this famous scene. If you know the movie, it's where the scene pans up from the outside along the edge of a skyscraper until you're looking into this window, this beautiful New York flat. Really quite extraordinary image. And you can see again how facile Peters was as a renderer. In 1933, Peters was getting commissions. How, I don't know, because there were very, very few private houses built in 1933, but he did a commission for somebody named Lawrence Shepard in San Marino. San Marino is over by Pasadena. Beautiful, beautiful example of that form language of the time. Would have been rather more typical for Southern Florida in this period, but again, really rather interesting. That year, 1933, and in 1932, I found, among other things, the tax returns that Peters had filed. And I found out something quite extraordinary, which was Peters was earning the equivalent of almost $500,000 a year working for Paramount. A really extraordinary amount of money in the Depression, which is why he went back and did this. But he was doing actually economically really quite well. Here's the interior of the Shepherd House. You can see that oculus window, the same that you see in the front of the building. There it is, and his own furniture. But the problem was by 1933, tuberculosis was catching up with Peters. He was having to stop and catch his breath when he was out walking. He was getting more and more thin, really truly emaciated. And you see this in the last photograph of him taken in early 1934. He's up in the mountains. This is with a bristlecone pine. And you can see he's just skin and bones. And in the early spring of that year, while he was sitting at his desk, he simply just fell over and dropped dead. He was still a young man. He doesn't look like it in the photograph. He looks quite ancient, actually, in the photograph, like the tree. But in fact, he was born in 1889, so he was not an old man by this time. Had he lived, I suspect Jock Peters would be a much more famous architect than he is now. I tried to give him his due in the book, but it'll take time for people to understand truly how extraordinary he was as an architect and designer, as a multifaceted architect and designer, somebody who contributed mightily to the beginnings of, or the early years of modernism. And with that, I will stop and I will entertain any questions you might have. Thank you so very much for your time and attention. This was fun for me. I didn't reveal this, but I'm sitting actually at 7,000 feet in the mountains of Colorado at the moment. So my view is not the view of London. My view is the view of the high mountains of Colorado. So please, if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer any of them.
Thank you, Chris, for a wonderful talk from Colorado.
From Colorado.
It's been really enlightening to learn about Jock Peters. Really sad to hear about his untimely death from tuberculosis. And actually, we appreciate the work that you've done to highlight his contribution to modernist architecture. I can see we have a question from Caroline, and she says, considering Peter's innovative contributions to Art Deco design, why do you think his legacy is less prominent compared to some of his peers? And that was a question that I had in my head also. I was thinking, why don't we know about him, basically? What happened? Was it his early death?
It was partly his early death. It's the perfect question to ask. So thank you, Caroline. That's the perfect question. There are multiple reasons. One reason is that so much of what he designed was never executed. So there's remarkable designs he did for the films were not filmed. And the interiors that he designed didn't survive. So Hollander doesn't survive. If Hollander survived, everyone would go to New York to see it. And very little, only a portion of what he did at Bullock survived. Very little else of anything that he made survived. And you'll notice you saw very specific photographs and very specific drawings because so much of this didn't come into our time. But there's one other reason that I think that he didn't become famous. And that was because he was something of a chameleon as a designer. He did Art Deco on Tuesday, and on Wednesday, he worked in a way that was much more like a conventional international style modernist. And on Thursday, he did things that looked expressionist. And because he was difficult to pigeonhole or difficult to label, you can't look at a piece of work and say immediately, oh, that's Jock Peters, unless you looked at a lot of Jock Peters as I have. He's not someone whose work is immediately identifiable. So it's all those things. The temporariness of his work, and then the fact that his hand is not so readily identifiable as many other architects are.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
We have another question from Lorna. Thank you, Lorna. Other than the interior of the law offices, are there any of his buildings still standing?
Yes. Yes, there are, I have to count them in my head. There are 5 houses still standing. One of them has its interiors, actually 2 of them have their interiors fairly well intact. I didn't show those because they're much more in the vein of the international style. There's Bullock's itself, which is becoming ever better known in Los Angeles. And Southwestern Law School does have regular tours. So if you do find yourselves in Los Angeles, it is worth scheduling a tour. What you can still see in Bullock's is remarkable. Even though a good bit of it has been lost, it's still fairly remarkable. But beyond that, the only other things one can see are the projects that he collaborated on with Bensel and others in Hamburg. Some of those survived the bombing of the Second World War.
Okay, yeah. Wonderful, thank you. And Caroline has just messaged again. She asked the first question to say thank you so much for the answer and greetings from Scotland.
Oh, thank you. Well, probably similar climate today, actually.
Okay, and we have another question, this time from Beth. She says, I lost connection for a minute, so maybe just asked. No, I don't think it has been, Beth. But then she goes on to ask, how much media coverage did the Hollander store receive? Did contemporaries know of design / store? Any responses?
So that's also a wonderful question. The answer is when it first opened, it did receive a good bit of media attention in the major New York newspapers and even in the Brooklyn newspapers. It also received attention in the national design magazines like Architectural Record. And the reviews were glowing. The reviews were very, very positive. There was an additional very interesting part of that story. The building was not designed by Lemaire and Peters that it was in. The building was designed by a company called Shreve, Lamb and Harmon. And if you know that name, they were the designers of the Empire State Building. It was the last project they did before they worked on the Empire State Building. So,
Mm,
you know, he was in very good company. And the building itself was very positively reviewed in the architectural press. The interiors were very positively reviewed, but the interiors really only existed for a few months. That's the extraordinary thing. They invested so much time and so much money in these interiors, and the store closed and they vanished. The most remarkable thing. Millions of
mm,
dollars in today's currency or pounds, and it just all vanished.
mm.
Amazing. Yeah, amazing.
Yeah.
Oh.
Okay. I don't think we have any more questions. I just wanted to say that I loved seeing the stunning interiors of Bullocks, and it was fascinating. It was amazing to see the lift doors, which I
Mm-hmm.
think you said were used in
In
Poirot.
Poirot, yeah, yeah, it's so
Yes,
funny.
which
And
we're
I didn't
very
realize
familiar
until
with him.
I was watching a rerun of Poirot earlier this year of all things. And I thought, oh, those elevator doors. Isn't that funny?
Oh, that's just lovely. And also, I loved the Christmas cards, the Christmas card designs. I don't know whether they're still in print anywhere or no.
There was only the single one.
Mm-hmm.
So the family, this was Kem Weber's family, and they'd kept all these Christmas cards that they'd been exchanging with the other German born and Austrian born designers in Los Angeles.
Yeah, yeah.
This is quite a thing. And unfortunately, the granddaughter or the daughter that I was working with, she passed away, and somehow the
Oh,
family managed to lose the file with all the Christmas cards in it. I
oh,
hope
that's
I
such a
hope that they weren't
shame.
thrown away. It's a beautiful design. Uh,
Yeah,
and you can see just how remarkably skilled he was.
yes.
1929, it looks like something from the 1950s, but
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, it's remarkable.
Mm, okay. Oh, we do have another question from Beth again. Thank you, Beth. Also, she says, had he lived, do you think he would have been recognized as one of the important set designers if he'd continued working in film industry?
Uh, So he died exactly at the moment when the Hollywood film industry really took off because he was
Mm,
working just as the talkies were beginning. 1933, the beginning of 1934 was just when the industry was taking off. I don't know that he would have continued to work in the Hollywood film industry much past 1935. He didn't like it. I think he
mhm,
would have gone back and worked as a freelance architect. I think he would have become quite well known, not as a designer of Art Deco buildings or interiors, but as an architect of international style, you know, for lack of a better word, what we call high modernism now. He was already
uh-huh,
working very much in that idiom by that time. Again, he was quite gifted at doing that. He would have become perhaps as well known as Richard Neutra had he lived. He was considered to be, at that time to be one of the 4 or 5 best architects on the West Coast. So
mm,
one assumes that had he lived on, he would have actually become very, very well known.
yeah.
Uh, um, yeah, yeah, it's a sad
Okay.
story. Yeah,
Yeah, it's sad. It's quite tragic. Um, okay, and Valentina has asked a question. She says, thank you, very interesting talk. You alluded to it, but considering what you said about him being multifaceted and difficult to label, what would you say is his legacy and influence on following generations?
yeah, that's a tricky one. Again,
It's a good question.
you have a very smart audience, so you have very good questions.
Yeah, I know that's an amazing question.
So one of the things that's very interesting that came out of all of this is Jock Peters, of course, is a lost son for Germany. And I will
Uh-huh.
tell you that they didn't know very much about what he had done in America. He was
Mm,
considered at the point when he left Germany in 1922, he was already regarded as one of the top 5 or 6 young architects in Germany. So
Mhm.
that's saying something. That's, because it's a remarkable period for German architecture. The fact that he had been the chief assistant to Peter Behrens, very, very important architect. He had just
Mhm.
replaced Walter Gropius, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, and Le Corbusier, tells you something about how he was regarded at the time. He was seen as the next, big thing in Germany.
Mhm.
And a few German historians had done a little work on him in Los Angeles, but because almost all of the archive was in family hands, they couldn't work out really what he had done. So when I
Mhm.
published the book, there was a lot of response from Germany. So one of the legacies is that he had an important impact on Germany in the beginnings of German modernism. He was a significant figure in the story of German modernism. He's certainly a significant figure in the development of modernism on the West Coast, and in 3 ways. That's the interesting thing. Because of his work in the film industry, because of what he contributed to Art Deco, as we would now define it, but also what he contributed to what we would now think of as the international style modernism. So he was
Mhm.
active in all of those areas. He's also actually fairly active in the language of expressionism in Germany. Um, what would have his impact been had he lived? That's the really interesting question.
Mhm. Mhm.
He was, again, such a chameleon. I couldn't tell you if he was going to be pink on Thursday or green. No way to predict what his work by 1938 or 1939 would have looked like,
Mhm.
because he was so interested in trying out everything. That's the best way to describe it. He was like a gourmand who tried out everything, and he liked it all.
Mhm. And
Yeah,
it's interesting how he went to the States because of his illness
yeah.
for the better
And
climate.
the fact that his brother was there, so he had a sponsor immediately. He
Oh,
did, by the way, I didn't tell you the full story. He did bring the wife and the 5 children over,
oh, he
not too long.
did. Oh, good.
So it took
Didn't
about a
leave
year for
them.
him to earn enough money for him to bring the wife and children, but he did.
Yeah. Mhm.
And I was fortunate actually to interview one of the children. So by the time I started working on the book,
Mhm.
there were 5 children. There were 4 girls and a boy. And contrary to all expectations, the boy outlived his sisters, which is very
Really?
unusual. Yeah, he
Mhm.
was 96 when I interviewed him. And I called him one day, and his daughter-in-law answered, and she said, I don't know if this is a good day. His name was Dirk Peters, for you to talk to Dirk. But I said, fine, okay, I'll call him on a different day, and hung up the phone. And 2 minutes later, the phone rang, and the man said, this is Dirk Peters. Let me tell you about my father. And he spoke for 3 hours, basically without drawing a breath.
Uh-huh.
All this information about his father that I probably couldn't have gleaned anywhere else, including one thing that turned out to be utterly untrue, but he didn't know it. And then his daughter-in-law got on again and said, that's probably enough for Dirk today. He's old, and we'll
Mhm.
call you again. And 3 days later, she called me back and she said, Dirk died.
Oh no.
He went back to
Oh,
bed after he talked to you and never regained consciousness.
oh my goodness.
That's a hell of a story.
That
Um,
it is, yeah.
and he waited all that time, I think, to tell somebody the story of his father. And I guess
Hmm.
he unburdened himself and figured, okay, I'm done.
Yeah. Well,
The
I
story
think
was,
you were the right person to tell.
yeah, the story that he told me that was absolutely untrue was that the parents had told the children when they moved to America, because he was very unpopular to be German in America in 1923
Hmm.
because of the recent war. They had told the children, that their father had been a conscientious objector, that he had not been in the war. And
Okay.
that way they could go to school and say, we were good Germans, Daddy was not in the war. And all the children believed this to the day they died, apparently. I knew it was not true because Germany didn't have conscientious objectors. Um, Basically, they put you in jail, they put a bullet in your head, or they sent you to the front. That was the 3 options you had in the German army. So I knew that it was not true, but I was able to confirm it because one of the extraordinary things I found in this research was his military record. And the reason it's extraordinary is that soldiers normally didn't keep them. They went back to the army, and all of them were destroyed in World War II. So to see one physically is completely extraordinary. And for
Mm.
some reason, his had never been given back to the army. And so I knew what he was doing almost on every day of the war, where he was,
Wow.
what he was doing, how what his superiors thought of him and so forth. And the story became very, very clear what had happened. Also because of the letters that he and his wife had exchanged. So I also had the letters, and I
Mhm.
knew he had found out very suddenly that he had tuberculosis. He didn't know this, literally to the day he was supposed to be in the trenches.
My
He just, yeah,
goodness.
yeah. Well,
Okay.
amazing story. You can't make these things up, right?
It is, I know, it's amazing. But Chris, unfortunately, I think we have run out of
Yep.
time.
All good.
But that has been amazing, and it's just been brilliant to learn about somebody who we should know more about.
Yeah. Please, please,
Um,
please, I would tell your members, please do, I can't shill for the book, the publisher can, but I say, at least please look at the book if you don't buy it, because it
yeah,
really is an extraordinary
yeah,
story.
it does look amazing with a wealth of photographs, and we will certainly be posting another link to it on Amazon on our social media.
Thank you to
So
you,
thank you,
Ruthie.
Chris.
Thank you to your
Th-
members, and have a lovely, lovely evening, everyone.
Thank you. Everyone who purchased a ticket tonight, and there have been quite a lot of you, will be sent a link to Vimeo where you can watch the webinar again. Our July webinar is yet to be confirmed, but please keep an eye on our website and social media for an update. All of our events are open to priority booking for members for 48 hours and then on general release. So it's really worth becoming a member to secure your spot. Members also receive discounted tickets and other benefits. So see you next time. Thank you, Chris, and our audience for joining us this evening. And good night, everybody. Thank
Night,
you.
everyone. Bye-bye.
Good night.